Hi there. Before we dive in, it's a fun idea if you drop a comment with your location. Thanks. Make sure to like and subscribe. Let's settle in and get started. I always believed our marriage was, if not perfect, at least stable. Julie and I had been together for 7 years, and while we weren't a couple who paraded affection in front of others, I took comfort in the predictable rhythms of our life. Our mornings followed the same routine: a quiet breakfast, Julia skimming emails on her phone while I sipped my coffee, each of us slipping into our respective roles before heading off to work. It was mundane, but it was ours. In hindsight, perhaps the small changes began months ago. At first, they were easy to ignore. Julia started coming home later than usual, explaining it away with work events or drinks with colleagues. I didn't question it. Why would I? We'd always trusted each other. I attributed her increasing absence to the demands of her job, and when she came home tired and distant, I told myself it was just stress. Everyone deals with busy seasons at work, right? So I let it go. I prided myself on not being the jealous type, not being insecure. But the subtle cracks in the surface of our life began to widen. Julia's conversations with me grew more clipped, as though she couldn't be bothered to indulge in the trivialities of daily life. I noticed how her phone became a constant companion, always within reach, her fingers dancing across the screen with a practiced quickness. Texts would come in and she'd offer vague explanations. "Just a work thing," she'd say with a dismissive wave of her hand. I'd nod, forcing myself to believe her. But the nagging feeling in my chest became harder to ignore. The weight of suspicion pressing against the calm facade I worked hard to maintain. Still, I didn't let my mind run wild with accusations. It wasn't who I was. I didn't let emotions control me. That was a rule I'd always lived by. Instead, I began to observe, quietly, meticulously, like a chess player watching his opponent's subtle shifts in strategy. When Julia would return from her increasingly frequent late nights, I'd ask casual questions, never letting on that I was cataloging every word she said, every detail that didn't quite add up. I found myself noticing small but significant changes in her demeanor, the way she'd glance at her phone with an almost imperceptible flicker of guilt, the sudden influx of new outfits hanging in her closet, more form-fitting than anything she'd worn before. I remember one particular evening, about a month ago, when Julia came home after midnight, her makeup still flawless despite the late hour, her smile brittle. "Sorry, it ran long," she murmured, kissing my cheek in a gesture that felt more like an obligation than affection. I glanced at the clock, 1:17 a.m., and smiled back, masking the slow burn of doubt that was now steadily growing within me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. Yet, as I lay next to her in bed that night, her back turned toward me, my mind kept turning over the inconsistencies. The late nights, the vague answers, the increasing distance between us, individually they could all be explained. Together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. But I didn't confront her. No, I wasn't impulsive enough to rush into accusations without proof. If there was one thing I knew about myself, it was that I needed control. If I was going to act, it would be deliberate, calculated, and undeniable. I wouldn't be the fool who lashed out and regretted it later. For now, I waited. Patience had always been my strong suit, and I knew that whatever was hiding beneath the surface would reveal itself eventually. People like Julia, those who think they can hide secrets, always slip up. I just had to be ready when she did. It was during these quiet moments, lying next to her as the hours ticked by in the dark, that I began to plan. Not consciously at first, but the thoughts were there, growing like vines twisting through my mind with quiet determination. I imagined scenarios, what I would do if my suspicions were confirmed, how I would handle it, not like a man scorned, but like a tactician. There was power in being prepared, and I intended to wield it when the time came. I still acted the part of the doting husband, ensuring Julia never suspected my growing awareness. We went to dinner with friends, hosted small gatherings, laughed at inside jokes. But beneath my placid exterior, I was calculating every move, ready for when the truth would finally crack the thin veneer of our life. It wasn't anger I felt. Anger would have been too easy. What simmered inside me was something colder, something sharper. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about control. And if Julia had thought she could take that away from me, she had miscalculated. Severely. I remember the exact moment I realized that the small cracks in my marriage weren't the benign symptoms of life's natural wear and tear. They were gaping wounds, infected by Julia's betrayal. The discovery didn't come in a dramatic confrontation or through an emotional confession. It came quietly on an ordinary evening when she left her phone unattended in the living room. She had gone to take a shower, leaving the familiar device glowing softly on the coffee table. I hadn't planned to touch it. I wasn't that kind of husband, but something had changed in me in the past few months. The growing distance between us, the late nights she spent at work, the new wardrobe, there were too many signs I couldn't ignore. The phone was a temptation I could no longer resist. It was there and I was there, and it was time to see if my suspicions were rooted in reality or if I was letting paranoia get the best of me. I opened it. No passcode. Strange, given how guarded she'd been recently. Her messages were right there, laid out before me in plain view. I scrolled through the mundane conversations she had with her colleagues and friends. Then my finger paused over a name I recognized all too well. David, her boss. I'd met him several times at her work functions. He was a charming man, wealthy, the kind of person who was always surrounded by people. He had charisma that filled the room. And apparently he had my wife. I read the messages between them. They started innocuously enough, work-related exchanges that gradually morphed into flirtations. My stomach twisted as I scrolled further, the flirtations turning into innuendo, then into explicit details of their nights together. Each word I read was another nail in the coffin of my marriage. I felt detached from my body, like I was watching someone else read this grotesque story, one where the protagonist was too blind to see what was happening right in front of him. But what surprised me the most was how calm I felt. No anger surged through me, no urge to shout or throw the phone against the wall. Instead, I felt a cold clarity settle in. I understood now what I had been too careful to admit to myself. Julia wasn't the woman I thought she was, and our marriage had been nothing more than a convenient cover for her double life. I closed the phone and set it back on the table, exactly where she had left it. The sound of the shower stopped, and I heard her moving around upstairs. My hands were steady, my breath even. I wasn't going to explode, wasn't going to confront her in a fit of rage. That's what she would expect. But I had no intention of being predictable. My reaction would come, but it would be on my terms, and it would be slow, deliberate. I had no interest in giving her the satisfaction of knowing she had broken me. When she came back downstairs, smiling in that way that had become more of a performance than an expression of affection, I smiled back. "Everything okay?" she asked, oblivious to the storm that had just passed. "Yeah," I replied, "just catching up on some reading." That night, as we lay in bed, the weight of her betrayal pressed against me like a physical presence. But I remained still, feigning sleep. Her breathing was steady, relaxed, like she hadn't a care in the world. I wondered how many times she had come home to our bed after being with him, how many lies she had told without a second thought. And yet, there she was, lying beside me as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She just didn't know it yet. I spent the next few days collecting myself, playing the part of the oblivious husband, going about my routines, and pretending that everything was just as it had always been. But behind my calm exterior, I was already planning. I needed to understand the full scope of the situation. It wasn't enough to know that she had been unfaithful. I needed details. I needed to know how long this had been going on, how deep it ran, and how far they were willing to take it. Every piece of information would be a weapon in the war I was preparing to wage. I began gathering evidence, starting with the phone. I downloaded the messages, cataloging each conversation with meticulous care. I noted the dates, the locations she mentioned, the excuses she had given me during those times. It was like putting together a puzzle, each piece fitting perfectly into the narrative I had suspected but hadn't been able to prove until now. When Julia wasn't around, I started following her movements more closely. I wasn't sloppy about it. I knew her schedule, her habits, and I made sure I was always 2 steps behind, never in a way that would make her suspicious. I watched her from a distance as she met David for drinks, as they laughed together in some corner of a dimly lit restaurant. She thought she was safe, that her lies had shielded her from any consequences. I let her think that. The longer she believed it, the more satisfying it would be when the truth finally shattered her world. Every detail I uncovered was another step closer to the revenge I was carefully crafting. This wasn't about losing my wife. She had been lost long before I found out about the affair. No, this was about reclaiming the control she had so arrogantly thought she could take from me. I wasn't going to let her off with a simple confrontation or a bitter divorce. That would be too easy, too clean. She had made a mockery of our marriage. Sonia, our marriage. And for that, I intended to make her pay. The hardest part was maintaining the facade. I still had to live with her, sit across from her at the dinner table, exchange pleasantries like we were still the same couple we had been 7 years ago. But I managed it. Each time she smiled at me, I smiled back, imagining how that smile would crumble when everything fell apart. In moments of quiet, I thought about how this all began. Maybe if I had been more attentive, I could have seen the signs earlier. But what would that have changed? The outcome would have been the same. Julia had made her choice, and I was making mine. The difference was that she thought she was in control, and I knew that I was. As I gathered more information, I started building my timeline. It had started about a year ago, according to the messages, though I suspected there was more she hadn't said, more that I would uncover before this was over. I began noting every detail, where they met, when they met, how often they talked during the day. Every piece of information was valuable, not just for the satisfaction of knowing, but for the leverage it gave me. It wasn't just about ruining her, it was about ruining them both. David had a reputation to protect, and I knew that once his wife found out, once his colleagues found out, he would lose everything he'd built. Julia, too, would see her world crumble, and I would be the one to pull the strings. But not yet. Patience had always been one of my strongest traits, and I intended to use it to my advantage. For now, I waited, watched, calculated. Each day brought me closer to the moment when I would strike. I knew it would be devastating for both of them, and that knowledge was enough to keep me going. I had to be careful. Every move I made had to be measured, each step calculated so that Julia never suspected what was coming. In the days after I discovered the affair, I perfected the mask of normalcy. To her, I was the same husband, attentive, mildly detached, but present. To me, every moment was a chance to observe and gather more information. The last thing I wanted was for her to feel anything was off, for her to sense the storm I was quietly building behind the scenes. The first step was surveillance. Julia was careful, or at least she thought she was. But people always leave breadcrumbs, and I was more than prepared to follow them. It began with the simple act of monitoring her phone. She had become lax in her caution, never bothering to change her password, assuming I wouldn't notice the subtle changes in her behavior. I knew her routines, her friends, and her colleagues. I knew how she conducted herself when she was in work mode, and now I knew how she acted when she was hiding something. Every evening when she went to bed, I'd wait for her to fall asleep. Once her breathing steadied and I was sure she was deeply asleep, I'd slip into the living room with her phone and read the messages between her and David. It wasn't just the content of the conversations that interested me, although those were enough to make my blood boil. It was the details they carelessly left in their exchanges, the places they met, the things they discussed, the timeline of their rendezvous. Each conversation was another piece of evidence that I carefully compiled. Photos, screenshots, dates. I saved everything into a folder, a dossier that would eventually serve as the foundation of my revenge. It wasn't enough to know where and when. I needed more. I needed to infiltrate her world. And to do that, I had to play the long game. I started paying more attention to the people in her life, the friends she confided in, the ones who knew about David but hadn't told me. The fact that none of them had said anything only added to my determination. They were complicit, even if indirectly, and I had no intention of letting them walk away unscathed. But for now, I needed them. I reached out to one of her friends, Lily, under the guise of trying to plan a surprise for Julia's birthday. It was the perfect cover. Lily had always liked me, always thought of me as the stable, dependable husband. She was eager to help, thinking it was a sweet gesture. Over coffee, I started asking her casual questions about Julia, how she'd been doing, how work was going, if she'd noticed anything different lately. Lily didn't even blink. She opened up like a book, revealing more than she realized. Julia had been distant, more preoccupied than usual, but Lily chalked it up to work stress. That's what Julia had told her friends. Work was demanding, her boss was breathing down her neck. The irony was almost laughable. The more I listened, the more I realized how deeply Julia had deceived everyone around her. It wasn't just me. Her entire life had become a web of lies with David at the center. I made mental notes of everything Lily told me, all while maintaining the appearance of the concerned, loving husband. It was almost too easy. By the time we finished our coffee, I had learned enough to confirm what I had already suspected. Julia had been lying to everyone. And they, in their ignorance, had believed her. The next phase of my plan was to create psychological pressure. Julia was already living in a house of cards, and I intended to make her feel every tremor as it slowly collapsed around her. I started small, subtle things that would make her question herself, question her stability. A missing earring here, a forgotten conversation there. I'd leave the kitchen light on after she turned it off, move her keys from their usual spot. Minor annoyances that she would brush off at first, but that would begin to pile up, chipping away at her sense of control. It was fascinating to watch. At first, she didn't notice the small disruptions, but over time, the stress of juggling her lies began to show. She became more irritable, snapping at me over insignificant things. She complained about losing her things, about feeling forgetful, and I'd reassure her, telling her it was just stress from work. All the while, I watched with satisfaction as the cracks in her composure deepened. David, on the other hand, was more of a challenge. I couldn't be as direct with him, at least not yet. I had to isolate Julia first, make her feel the full weight of what was happening. I knew their affair wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. They confided in each other, shared secrets, made plans for a future that didn't include me. I needed to sever that connection, and the best way to do that was to plant seeds of doubt between them. One night, I sat down at my computer and wrote an anonymous email to David's wife. I'd met her a few times at company events, a quiet woman who seemed to live in her husband's shadow. I wondered if she had any idea what was happening, if she suspected that her husband was spending more time with Julia than with her. My email was simple, just a few lines hinting at David's infidelity, but vague enough to keep me in the clear. I didn't need her to confront him directly, not yet. I just needed her to start asking questions to make him nervous. I watched for the signs over the next few days. Julia's phone buzzed with more frequency, her conversations with David shorter, more strained. I knew it was working. Whatever was happening on his end, he was pulling back, and it was only a matter of time before Julia started to feel the distance. And when she did, I would be there, watching, waiting for the moment she realized how alone she truly was. At work, things were starting to shift for her too. I had learned enough from her friends and from the messages to know that her job was important to her, that she prided herself on her professionalism. So I began planting doubts there as well. I sent another anonymous tip, this time to her employer, suggesting that Julia's relationship with her boss was compromising her work. I made it sound as if it were coming from a concerned colleague, someone who had noticed the favoritism, the inappropriate nature of their relationship. It didn't take long for the effects to ripple through her workplace. Julia came home one evening tense, her usual facade of calm cracking. She poured herself a glass of wine before even greeting me, her hands shaking slightly as she told me about a meeting she'd had with her supervisor. Someone had raised concerns about her professionalism, she said, her voice tight with frustration. She didn't know who, but the accusations had been serious enough to warrant an investigation. She swore to me that it was all lies, that someone was trying to undermine her. I listened, nodded, and offered my support, all the while reveling in the knowledge that I was the one pulling the strings. The more she unraveled, the more I tightened the noose. I began to withdraw emotionally, just as David had. It was subtle at first, an extra hour at work, less interest in her day-to-day life. I became a mirror of her own behavior. Detached, distracted, just enough to make her notice, but not enough to raise alarm. The goal wasn't to confront her, at least not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of everything crashing down around her, to make her question every relationship in her life. It was working. Her friends were pulling away, her job was under scrutiny, and David was becoming distant. Julia's once perfect world was collapsing, and I was enjoying every second of it. I could see the toll it was taking on her. Dark circles under her eyes, the constant tension in her shoulders, the way she reached for her phone more often, seeking reassurance from a man who was slipping further out of her grasp. And still, she had no idea that I was behind it all. Watching her struggle was satisfying, but I knew this was only the beginning. I had more in store, more ways to tighten the net around her. The beauty of it was that she couldn't trace any of it back to me. Every move I made was designed to appear as if her world was falling apart due to her own choices. The irony was delicious. She had thought she could deceive me, could live a double life without consequences. But the reality was that she had been playing right into my hands all along. I wasn't done yet. The final phase of my plan was still to come, but for now, I was content to watch as Julia continued to spiral. Her life was becoming a prison of her own making, and I held the key to every door she thought she had locked behind her. The next few weeks would be critical. I had to escalate without overplaying my hand, continue applying pressure while keeping my role hidden. It was a delicate balance, but one I was more than capable of maintaining. And when the time came to deliver the final blow, I wanted it to be devastating. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her betrayal, to know that everything she had built with David, everything she had hidden from me, was crumbling at her feet. And when that moment arrived, I would be there, silent, watching, smiling. The time had come to escalate. I'd set the stage, nudged Julia's life into disarray, but now I needed to tighten the noose. She was already unraveling, her confidence fraying at the edges as the subtle manipulations I'd orchestrated slowly crept into every facet of her life. Now it was time to push harder, to take bolder steps towards her inevitable downfall. It started with her job. Julia had always taken immense pride in her work. Being seen as competent and respected by her peers was something she valued above all else. She believed her professional life was separate from the chaos brewing in her personal one. That would be her first mistake. I sent another anonymous message to her employer, this time directly to the head of human resources. I hinted at inappropriate behavior, suggesting that Julia's relationship with David had crossed professional boundaries and was affecting the office environment. I knew it wasn't enough to get her fired outright. That would be too obvious, too sudden. But it was enough to make them watch her, to question her integrity. A slight whisper in the right ear was all it took. The rest, I trusted, would spiral naturally. A few days later, Julia came home earlier than usual. Her face was tight, her eyes shadowed with stress. She poured herself a glass of wine, as she'd done often recently, and sat at the kitchen table, staring into space. I sat across from her, watching her carefully, pretending to be engrossed in my book. "They had a meeting at work today," she finally said, her voice strained. "They're investigating some kind of complaint about my conduct." I raised my eyebrows, feigning surprise. "What kind of complaint?" She shook her head, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Something about favoritism and professionalism. "They didn't say much, but I can tell they're watching me." "Do you think it's related to David?" I asked innocently, laying the bait. Her eyes flickered, her mind already running through 100 possibilities. She was good at covering her tracks, but in that moment I saw the panic, the creeping fear that maybe, just maybe, someone knew. "I don't know," she murmured. "It doesn't make sense." But it made perfect sense to me. I watched as the weight of her double life began to crush her. She was balancing on a knife's edge, and all it would take was one more push to send her toppling over. Next, I turned my attention to David. I hadn't engaged directly with him yet, choosing instead to let the distance between him and Julia grow naturally. But now it was time to make him feel the consequences of his actions. I sent an anonymous letter to his wife detailing his affair with Julia in precise clinical terms. I included dates, locations, and even screenshots of their text messages. I didn't embellish. There was no need. The truth was damning enough. I imagined the scene in David's home when his wife opened the letter, the slow realization that her husband had been unfaithful. I didn't need to see it to know how it would play out. I knew David would panic, would try to deny everything at first. But the evidence was irrefutable. His life would implode, just as Julia's was beginning to. The beauty of it all was that none of them could trace it back to me. I was a ghost in the background, pulling the strings, invisible to those who thought they were in control. Julia, David, they were both so arrogant, so certain that they could conduct their affair without consequence. They had no idea that the very things they'd tried to hide were now the weapons I was using to destroy them. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in Julia's behavior. She became more withdrawn, her phone constantly in her hand, checking it obsessively as though waiting for some message that would never come. I knew David had begun to pull away from her, likely trying to salvage whatever was left of his marriage. He wasn't answering her calls as often, wasn't making time to see her. The distance between them was growing, and it was driving her mad. One evening she came home late, her face pale and drawn. I could see the strain etched into her features, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set her bag down. I said nothing, waiting for her to speak. "He's pulling back," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "David. Something's wrong and I don't know what to do." I feigned concern, my voice calm and steady. "Maybe he's just dealing with things at home. You've said his wife is suspicious." She nodded, but I could see the desperation in her eyes. She was losing control, and she knew it. Everything she'd built with David, the lies she'd told herself about their future, was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I let her stew in that misery for a while, watching as her world continued to unravel. Her job became more stressful, her friends more distant, and David more elusive. Every aspect of her life was fraying, and the more she tried to hold it together, the more it fell apart. It was time for the final move. It was. I'd spent weeks collecting every bit of evidence I needed, and now I was ready to lay it all bare. I compiled the messages between Julia and David, the photos, the receipts, everything I'd meticulously gathered. I made copies, careful to ensure there was no way to trace them back to me. One afternoon while Julia was at work, I sent the packages. One to her employer, one to David's wife, and one to our closest friends. I imagined the chaos that would ensue once they opened the envelopes, once they saw the truth laid out in front of them. Julia's carefully constructed life would shatter in an instant, and there would be no recovering from it. That evening I waited. I knew it wouldn't take long for the fallout to reach her. She came home later than usual, her face pale and ashen. She didn't speak as she walked past me and into the living room, collapsing onto the couch. I followed her, standing in the doorway, watching her silently. "They know," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everyone knows." I said nothing, letting the silence stretch between us. She was breaking, and I wanted her to feel every second of it. My job. They've suspended me pending an investigation. And David, he won't even return my calls. His wife found out, and now he's gone. Everything. It's all gone. Her voice cracked, and for the first time in months, I saw the raw fear in her eyes. The realization that everything she'd taken for granted, her career, her affair, her reputation, had been stripped away from her in an instant. I stepped closer, my voice calm, almost soothing. "I told you, Julia, lies have a way of catching up with you." She looked up at me, confusion flickering across her face. What? What are you saying?" I crouched down in front of her, my eyes locking onto hers. "I knew. I've known for months. About you and David, about everything." And I let you think you were safe. I let you believe you could get away with it. Her face went pale, her eyes widening as the truth sank in. You? I stood, my expression cold and unreadable. This is what happens, Julia, when you betray someone who trusted you. When you think you can live two lives without consequence. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You did this? I nodded slowly. I did. And now you get to live with the consequences. She sobbed, her body trembling as the weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. I felt no sympathy, no remorse. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the culmination of everything I'd carefully planned. And it was more satisfying than I could have imagined. Over the next few days, Julia's life completely fell apart. Her employer moved swiftly, terminating her position once the full extent of her unprofessional behavior was revealed. David disappeared from her life entirely, his wife having filed for divorce and cut him off from everything. Our friends, those who had once admired her, now looked at her with disdain, their judgment seeping through every interaction. Julia was a pariah, and there was no escaping it. I watched from the sidelines as I had from the beginning. My role in her downfall remained a secret. No one suspected that I had been the architect of her destruction. To them, it was just the natural consequence of her poor choices, the inevitable collapse of a life built on lies. But I knew the truth. I knew that every step she'd taken, every decision she'd made, had been carefully guided by the strings I'd pulled. I had been in control all along, and now that control had paid off. The house was quieter now. Julia barely spoke, her once vibrant energy reduced to a hollow shell of the woman she'd once been. I should have felt something, maybe satisfaction, maybe relief. But instead I felt nothing. The victory was hollow. The revenge I'd sought for so long now seemed like an empty prize. I had won. There was no doubt about that. Julia's life was in ruins, and she had no one to blame but herself. But as I sat alone in the house we once shared, I realized that in destroying her, I had destroyed something in myself as well. The silence around me was deafening. Julia stayed, though I knew it wouldn't last. Eventually she would leave, too ashamed to face the world we once shared. And when she did, I would let her go without a second thought. Because in the end, there was nothing left to hold on to. Once the first domino fell, the rest tumbled down faster than I could have imagined. Julia's life, which she had worked so meticulously to preserve, was crumbling piece by piece. My manipulations had pushed her beyond the brink, and now everything was spiraling out of her control. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I had begun by isolating her, making sure she felt the walls closing in on all sides. Her career had been the first thing to collapse. After the anonymous tip about her affair with David, her employer took swift action. They suspended her pending a formal investigation, citing concerns about her professionalism and integrity. The woman who had once prided herself on her work was now cast out, her reputation in tatters. I watched her come home that day, a hollow shell of the person she once was. She barely spoke as she stepped into the house, her usual mask of confidence shattered. I knew she was wondering how it had all gone so wrong, how everything she had once controlled was now slipping through her fingers. But I still played my part, the concerned, supportive husband. I let her sob in my arms, muttering words of reassurance, all the while feeling the cold satisfaction of knowing I had orchestrated every tear. David, too, had begun to withdraw from her. I'd made sure of that. After sending the damning evidence of their affair to his wife, I knew his life was imploding just as fast as Julia's. His wife wasted no time. She filed for divorce immediately, citing infidelity, and began the process of dismantling his career, his social connections, everything. David, who had once been so confident in his secret affair, now found himself trapped in a marriage that was unraveling and a professional life tainted by scandal. He stopped answering Julia's calls and texts. At first it was subtle. He'd cancel their plans, say he was busy with work, or claim he needed to spend time at home. But over time, his distance became more pronounced. I could see the panic rising in Julia. David had been her escape, her thrill, and now he was abandoning her just when she needed him most. Julia's phone became her lifeline, the thing she clung to desperately. Every night, she would stare at it, waiting for David to respond, her fingers hovering over the screen as if willing a message to appear. But the longer the silence stretched, the more her composure cracked. I watched it happen in real time, her growing desperation as her lifeline frayed. I wasn't just content with taking away her career and her lover, though. I wanted her to feel utterly alone, stripped of every ounce of security she had built for herself. That's when I turned to her friends. Julia's social circle had always been close-knit. These were people she had known for years who trusted her and admired her. She had always been the charismatic one, the woman who held the group together. So I planted seeds of doubt, made quiet, offhand comments to mutual acquaintances. I suggested she had been acting strangely, implied that perhaps there was more to her professional downfall than met the eye. I mentioned that David's wife had left him in disgrace, hinting that Julia might have played a role in it. People love to gossip, and I knew it wouldn't take much for those whispers to spread. Slowly, her friends began to distance themselves from her. First, it was a canceled lunch, then unanswered texts. Julia began to notice, but she couldn't understand why. She'd built her life on maintaining these connections, and now they were slipping away just as everything else was. The beauty of it was that Julia never suspected me. Not once. She still believed I was on her side, that I was the only stable thing in her life. She would turn to me, exhausted, terrified, and I would offer comfort. I would tell her that things would get better, that maybe David would come around, or that her job would clear up the misunderstanding. It was all lies, of course, but I needed her to believe them. She needed to feel like there was still some semblance of hope, even as I carefully stripped that hope away, layer by layer. I could see the toll it was taking on her. Her once perfect appearance was disheveled. The dark circles under her eyes grew more pronounced as the sleepless nights stacked up. She stopped caring about the little things, her clothes, her hair, even our home. It was as though she was slowly fading, becoming a ghost in the life she used to dominate. Then came the final phase of my plan: exposure. It was time to tear away the last threads of her dignity, to make sure that everyone knew the truth. I gathered all the evidence I had been collecting, the text messages between her and David, the photos, the timelines, the sordid details of their affair. I made sure it was all packaged neatly and anonymously sent to the people who mattered most in her life. Her employer, of course, was at the top of the list, but I also sent it to her closest friends, her family, and David's colleagues. The fallout would be swift, and there would be no coming back from it. I waited, watching the clock, knowing it was only a matter of time before the chaos erupted. It started with her phone. It buzzed incessantly, calls from her boss, her friends, her family. She ignored them at first, too lost in her own misery to care, but eventually she answered one of the calls. I was sitting across from her when it happened, watching as her face drained of color, as the words from the other end of the line pierced whatever fragile composure she had left. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. How do you know about that?" She listened, her eyes wide, her hand gripping the phone so tightly I thought it might break. "That's not true," she stammered, but I could see in her expression that she knew it was over. "No, I can explain." The call ended abruptly, and she dropped the phone as though it had burned her. She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "They know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They know everything." I didn't move. I simply watched as the realization settled over her, as the full weight of her actions finally came crashing down. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The culmination of months of careful planning, every piece of evidence falling perfectly into place. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "How did this happen? How did they find out?" I stood, my expression calm, emotionless. "People always find out, Julia. Lies have a way of catching up with you." She shook her head, confusion and fear etched into every line of her face. "But I thought I was careful. I thought—" "You weren't," I interrupted, my voice cold. "You were sloppy. And now everyone knows the truth. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stared at me, her world crumbling around her. What am I supposed to do? I've lost everything, my job, my friends. David won't even speak to me. I felt a flicker of satisfaction at the mention of David. The man who had been the catalyst for all of this, the one who had stolen my wife, was now nothing more than a ghost in her life. He had abandoned her, just as I knew he would. You'll have to figure that out on your own, I said, turning away from her. This is your mess to clean up. Julia sobbed, collapsing into herself as the full weight of her isolation settled in. There was no one left to turn to, no one to help her. Everyone she had once counted on had either abandoned her or now saw her for what she truly was, a liar, a cheater, someone who had destroyed everything she touched. In that moment, I could have walked away, left her to wallow in her misery. But I had one more card to play, one final move that would ensure she never recovered. I knew Julia, I said quietly, my back still turned to her. I've known about the affair for months. She froze, her sobs quieting as my words registered. What? I knew, I repeated, turning to face her. I knew about you and David. I knew about the lies, and I let it happen. I let you believe you were getting away with it. Her face twisted in disbelief. You knew? I nodded. And I'm the one who made sure everyone else knew too. For a moment, she didn't speak, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what I had just confessed. And then the rage came, burning through the layers of grief and shock. You did this to me? She screamed, standing suddenly, her fists clenched. You ruined my life? I didn't ruin your life, Julia, I said calmly. You did that all on your own. Her anger faltered, giving way once more to despair. She sank back down onto the couch, her hands trembling as she tried to comprehend the depths of my betrayal. But it wasn't betrayal, not really. I had simply exposed the truth, something she had been running from for far too long. I left her there, her sobs echoing through the empty house as I walked away. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to do. Oh, I had won. Julia's life was in ruins, and there was no coming back from it. She was alone, abandoned by everyone who had once loved her, just as I had planned. But as I stood in the silence of the house, I realized something. The victory I had fought so hard for, the revenge I had meticulously crafted, felt hollow. I had destroyed Julia, yes, but in doing so, I had destroyed something in myself as well. I was alone now, too. It was time. Everything had been leading up to this moment. The weeks of careful planning, the subtle manipulations, the isolation I had so artfully crafted around Julia. Now I was ready to deliver the final blow, the one that would shatter her world completely. There would be no recovery from this, no way to rebuild the life she had once known. I had spent months watching her unravel, watching her try and fail to keep control of her carefully constructed facade. And now I would take it all away in one swift, deliberate move. I had gathered everything I needed, the messages between her and David, the incriminating photos, the emails, all of it meticulously organized and ready to be deployed. But I wasn't going to reveal it in some grand confrontation. That wasn't my style. Instead, I was going to let the truth come crashing down on her from every angle. Julia wouldn't know who had betrayed her, wouldn't know who had orchestrated her downfall. She would only know that everything she had worked so hard to hide had been exposed in the most humiliating way possible. I started by sending the evidence to David's wife. She deserved to know the truth about her husband's infidelity, and I knew that she wouldn't handle the news quietly. David had built his life on his reputation, his career, his social standing. Everything depended on the image he projected. And now, with one anonymous package, that image would be shattered beyond repair. His wife would make sure of that. Next, I turned my attention to Julia's employer. I sent them the same package of evidence, along with a letter detailing how her personal life had compromised her professionalism, how her relationship with her boss had crossed every boundary of decency. I made sure to include enough damning details to guarantee that they would have no choice but to terminate her. No company could afford the kind of scandal Julia was about to bring to their doorstep. Finally, I sent the evidence to our closest friends and family. I wanted everyone in her life to see her for who she truly was. The woman they thought they knew was a lie, and I was about to tear away the mask she had been wearing for so long. I could already imagine the looks on their faces as they opened those packages, the whispered conversations, the judgments. Julia would be left with nothing. No career, no friends, no reputation. And I would be there watching as everything fell apart. It didn't take long for the chaos to begin. The first sign was a phone call. Julia's phone buzzed insistently on the kitchen counter as she moved about the house, oblivious to the storm that was brewing around her. I watched from the living room as she glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing in confusion. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up. "Hello," she answered, her voice casual, unaware of what was coming. I could hear the faint sound of a voice on the other end, too quiet to make out the words. But I didn't need to hear them to know what was happening. It was David's wife, undoubtedly furious and heartbroken, confronting Julia with the evidence I had sent. Julia's face went pale as she listened, her free hand clutching the counter for support. What? What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "That's not... I don't know where you got that, but it's not true." Her denial was weak, hollow. She knew, even if she wasn't ready to admit it, that the truth had come out. She knew that the carefully spun web of lies was unraveling faster than she could stop it. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the counter. She stood there, frozen, her face drained of all color. I could see the panic in her eyes, the way her mind was racing to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so quickly. She turned to me, desperation clear in her expression. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They know. They know about David." I stood up slowly, keeping my face neutral, as though I had no idea what she was talking about. "Who knows?" "His wife," Julia choked out. She has pictures, emails. She's saying we had an affair, but I don't know how she could know. I don't understand." I crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what appeared to be support. "Maybe she's just paranoid," I suggested. "People sometimes see things that aren't there when they're suspicious." But Julia wasn't buying it. She knew deep down that this wasn't just paranoia. There was too much evidence, too much detail. Someone had exposed her, and she had no idea who it was. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it was her boss. The panic in her eyes deepened as she answered, her voice trembling. "Hello?" There was a long pause as she listened to the person on the other end. I could tell from the look on her face that it was worse than she had imagined. Her hand flew to her mouth as she tried to hold back a sob. "No, that's not true," she said, her voice breaking. "I would never... I didn't... Please, just let me explain." But it was too late. I could hear her boss's voice, sharp and unrelenting, cutting through her weak defenses. They had already made up their mind. Julia's career was over. She hung up the phone, her hands trembling violently. She looked up at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They're firing me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They think I was sleeping with David for promotions. They think I used my position to manipulate him. It's all lies." I kept my face neutral, suppressing the satisfaction bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm sure you can explain," I said softly. "Once they hear your side, maybe they'll change their mind." But we both knew there was no coming back from this. The damage had been done. Julia had been branded as a manipulator, a woman who had used her affair to climb the corporate ladder. And even if she could somehow convince them otherwise, the scandal would follow her for the rest of her life. The final blow came later that evening. Our friends, the people who had once been closest to us, began reaching out. Texts, calls, messages flooded in, each one more accusatory than the last. They had all seen the evidence. They all knew the truth. Julia sat on the couch, her phone clutched in her hands, her eyes wide and hollow as she read through the messages. The betrayal was complete. No one stood by her. No one was willing to believe her side of the story. As far as they were concerned, she was guilty, and they wanted nothing to do with her. "I've lost everything," she whispered, her voice raw with pain. My job, my friends, David, it's all gone. I sat beside her, watching as she crumbled beneath the weight of her own actions. I had thought this moment would bring me satisfaction, that seeing her so completely destroyed would fill the void her betrayal had left in me. But as I sat there, listening to her sob, I felt nothing. I had won. I had taken everything from her, just as she had taken everything from me. But the victory was hollow. There was no triumph in it, no sense of justice, just a gaping emptiness that left me feeling more alone than I had before. Julia looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. How did this happen? She asked, her voice broken. How did everything go so wrong? I didn't answer. What could I say? That I had been the one pulling the strings all along? That every step of her downfall had been meticulously planned and executed by the man she thought she could trust? No, I couldn't tell her that. Not because I feared the consequences, but because I didn't want her to know that she hadn't been fighting alone in this war. I wanted her to think that the world had turned against her, that fate itself had conspired to punish her for her infidelity. It was cruel, perhaps, but it was the only way to make sure that the scars I had inflicted on her would never heal. I don't know, I lied, my voice soft. But we'll get through this, somehow. She nodded weakly, too broken to question me further. As the days passed, the fallout from the revelation continued to spread. Julia's career was finished, her reputation irreparably damaged. David had disappeared from her life, leaving her with nothing but the bitter memory of their affair. Our friends, once a close-knit group, had all but abandoned her. She was truly alone, and so was I. The house, once filled with tension and hidden resentment, was now eerily quiet. Julia moved through it like a ghost, barely speaking, barely eating. And I watched her, waiting for the satisfaction I had sought for so long to finally arrive. But it never did. In the end, I realized that in destroying Julia, I had destroyed something in myself as well. I had become a man consumed by vengeance, a man who had sacrificed everything in the pursuit of retribution. And now, with my goal finally achieved, I had nothing left. No purpose, no direction, just a hollow victory that tasted like ash. I had won, but at what cost? I had won. I had planned each move, calculated every possible reaction, and executed my revenge with precision. Julia's life was in ruins, just as I had intended. But as I sat in the quiet house, the echo of her shouts still ringing faintly in my mind, a strange hollowness settled over me. I had imagined this moment for months. I had imagined the satisfaction, the feeling of justice, of reclaiming control, yet none of that materialized. The silence felt too thick, too heavy. I was alone, and for the first time I realized that perhaps I had always been alone. Julia had stopped speaking to me in any meaningful way. After everything had come crashing down, she became a shadow, retreating deeper into her own despair. She stayed in the guest room most nights, hardly eating, barely sleeping. I could feel her presence in the house, a constant reminder of what I had done. And even though I had told myself that her suffering was deserved, there was no satisfaction in seeing her broken. I had thought that revenge would heal something in me, that it would fill the void she had created with her betrayal. But instead, it seemed to have widened it. I had sacrificed everything to bring her down, only to find myself standing in the ashes of our life together, with nothing left to show for it. The truth was, I had been consumed by the need for revenge. It had taken over my every thought, my every action. And now that it was done, I wasn't sure what was left of me. The man I had been, the man who once loved Julia, who believed in our marriage, in the life we had built, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, someone who had traded love for bitterness as trust for cruelty. I couldn't even say when it had started, when I had truly become this version of myself. Was it the moment I discovered the affair? Or had it begun long before that, in the subtle distance that had grown between us over the years? Perhaps the seeds of my resentment had been planted far earlier, and the affair had only given me an excuse to water them, to let them flourish into something dark and twisted. I found myself reflecting on the small moments, the ones that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt loaded with meaning. The way she had stopped meeting my eyes when we spoke, the late nights at the office, the sudden need for space. All those warning signs I had ignored, convincing myself that they were normal, that we were just going through a rough patch like any other couple. In the end, it hadn't been about David or even the affair itself. It had been about control. Julia had taken something from me, my sense of security, my belief that our life was solid, and I had needed to take it back. But in my pursuit of control, I had lost everything else. I had become a man who thrived on destruction, and now, with nothing left to destroy, I was adrift. Julia was gone in every way that mattered, even though she still lived under the same roof. She had stopped reaching out to anyone, stopped trying to repair the relationships that had crumbled around her. It was as if she had accepted her fate, resigned herself to the life of isolation and shame I had crafted for her. One evening, I found myself standing outside her door, my hand hovering over the handle. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. Maybe I wanted her to fight back, to go someone to accuse me, to scream at me for what I had done. Or maybe I wanted her to apologize, to admit that everything had been a mistake and beg for some semblance of forgiveness. But when I finally opened the door, all I found was silence. She was sitting on the bed, staring at the wall, her face expressionless. She didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't even glance in my direction. For a moment, I considered speaking, but the words stuck in my throat. What could I say? What was there to say to a woman I had spent months destroying? So I left her there, in that room that had become her prison, and returned to the empty living room. The house felt colder than it ever had before. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us grew heavier. She remained in her room, a ghost in the home we had once shared, while I wandered aimlessly through the shell of our marriage. The satisfaction I had anticipated from her downfall had never come. Instead, I was left with a gnawing sense of loss, as if I had cut away a part of myself in the process of cutting her down. I began to question everything. Was it worth it? The months of planning, the careful execution of every move, the destruction of her career, her reputation, her relationships, had it all been worth the price I had paid? I had gotten what I wanted, hadn't I? Julia was broken and I was the victor. But standing alone in the wreckage of our lives, victory felt like an illusion, a prize that had turned to dust in my hands. One night, I sat in the dark, the house silent around me, and I realized that I didn't know who I was anymore. I had built my entire identity around my revenge, but now that it was over, I had nothing left. The man who had loved Julia, who had shared his life with her for 7 years, was gone, and in his place was someone I didn't recognize. I had become the very thing I despised, a man consumed by bitterness, by the need to control, to punish, and in the process, I had lost the one thing I hadn't even realized I still wanted: peace. As I sat there alone in the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder if I had truly won it all.